On a brutal February night in Chicago, Marcus Rodriguez gave his only coat to a shivering stranger at a bus stop, not knowing she was Elena Vasquez, CEO of EduTech Solutions. The wind sliced through Chicago's downtown streets like a knife, carrying with it the kind of February cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. Snow fell in thick, determined flakes, muffling the usual cacophony of traffic and transforming the city into something almost peaceful, almost forgiving. Under the pale glow of a flickering bus stop sign, Marcus Rodriguez pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his shoulders and checked his phone for the third time. The 354 bus was running late again. At 38, Marcus had the kind of tired eyes that come from too many double shifts and too many disappointments. His hands, once soft from years of holding chalk and grading papers, now bore the calluses of warehouse work. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his nights moving boxes filled with textbooks he'd never get to use again. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The manila envelope in his jacket pocket crinkling softly. 3 more rejection letters from school districts. 3 more polite ways of saying his 15 years of teaching experience weren't enough anymore. Then she appeared through the swirling snow, moving with the hurried gait of someone fleeing rather than traveling. Elena Vasquez looked like she belonged in a boardroom, not at a bus stop after midnight. Her tailored black suit was expensive, her heels clicking against the icy pavement with practiced precision. But something was wrong with the picture. She wore no coat, no scarf, nothing to protect her from the bitter wind that whipped her dark hair across her face. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, and even from a distance, Marcus could see her shoulders shaking. She stopped under the same shelter, breathing hard, and for the first time in months, Marcus found himself thinking about someone other than his own problems. This woman, whoever she was, looked like she was running from something far worse than the cold. Her makeup was smudged slightly at the corners of her eyes, and there was a tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with the temperature. She glanced around nervously as if expecting someone to follow her, then pulled out her phone with fingers so stiff from cold she nearly dropped it twice. Marcus watched her struggle for nearly a minute, before his conscience won the battle his practical mind was waging. He'd learned the hard way that kindness was a luxury most people couldn't afford, that good intentions often led to complications he didn't need. But watching this woman fight against the elements in clothing meant for climate-controlled offices reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten about himself. Before life stripped away his classroom, his marriage, his sense of purpose, he'd been the kind of man who helped. He'd been the teacher who stayed after school with struggling students, who bought lunch for kids who couldn't afford it, who believed that small acts of decency could change the world. Marcus stepped closer, his voice cutting through the wind with unexpected gentleness. "Excuse me, are you all right?" Elena looked up, startled, her dark eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like fear. For a moment, she seemed to consider ignoring him entirely. But the genuine concern in his voice made her pause. "I'm fine," she said, though her chattering teeth betrayed her words. Without hesitation, Marcus began shrugging out of his coat. "Here, take this. You're going to freeze out here." Elena immediately shook her head, stepping back instinctively. "No, I couldn't. You need it more than I do." But Marcus was already extending the worn wool toward her, his own thin sweater offering little protection against the brutal wind. "I've been cold before," he said simply. "This is different. Please." Something in his tone, perhaps the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years convincing reluctant teenagers to trust him, broke through her resistance. Elena allowed him to drape the coat over her shoulders, and the warmth was immediate, almost overwhelming. The fabric smelled faintly of coffee and something else she couldn't identify, something that felt like safety. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it closer. "I'm Elena." "Marcus," he replied, now visibly shivering but somehow looking more at peace than he had all evening. The distant rumble of the approaching bus interrupted the moment. As the doors hissed open, Elena reached into her purse and pressed a business card into his cold hand. "Just in case you ever need anything," she said, her eyes holding his for a brief, meaningful moment before she disappeared into the warm interior of the bus, still wrapped in his coat. Marcus stood alone at the bus stop, watching the red taillights disappear into the snow, and for the first time in months he wasn't thinking about his own problems. 3 years ago, he would have been grading papers right now, red pen in hand, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of lesson plans and student projects that covered every surface of his cramped but warm apartment. Room 247 at Lincoln High had been his kingdom for 15 years, where he'd transformed reluctant teenagers into passionate historians, where kids who'd never seen themselves as smart discovered they could debate the causes of the Civil War with the fervor of seasoned scholars. He'd been the teacher other teachers came to for advice, the one parents requested by name, the educator who stayed late every Tuesday to run the free SAT prep program that had helped dozens of first-generation college students earn scholarships they never thought possible. Marcus had built something beautiful in that classroom, something that mattered, something that changed lives one student at a time. Then the budget cuts came, swift and merciless, eliminating positions based on seniority rather than impact. 15 years of dedication meant nothing when the district needed to save money. The descent had been swift and brutal. Teaching jobs were scarce, and the few openings required certifications he couldn't afford to obtain. His wife Sarah had been patient at first, supportive even. But as the months stretched on and the bills piled higher, her frustration grew into resentment. She'd married a respected educator, not a man who stocked shelves at midnight and sent out resumes that disappeared into digital black holes. The divorce papers came 6 months after his last day in the classroom, another casualty of a system that discarded good people as easily as outdated textbooks. Now he lived in a studio apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs, working warehouse shifts that paid barely enough to cover rent and ramen noodles, but still sending out applications to every school district within 100 miles, still hoping that someone, somewhere, would see past the employment gap to the teacher he'd always been. 2 hours earlier, Elena Rodriguez had sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of EduTech Solutions, listening to men in $1,000 suits explain why her life's work was financially unsustainable. The irony wasn't lost on her that these investors, who'd never set foot in an underfunded classroom, were lecturing her about the business of education. "You need to cut the educational development team by 50%, Richard Blackstone had said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never struggled to afford textbooks. "Focus on the profitable sectors. Corporate training pays better than public schools." Elena had built EduTech from nothing, coding the first prototype in her cramped apartment while working 3 jobs to pay for community college. Her platform wasn't just software. It was a bridge across the digital divide that had nearly swallowed her own childhood whole. She remembered being 12, doing homework by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again, walking 2 miles to the library because they couldn't afford internet, watching classmates with laptops and tutors pull further ahead, while she fell further behind. Every algorithm she'd written, every feature she'd designed was born from that memory of being left out, locked out, forgotten. When the investors threatened to withdraw funding unless she abandoned the very communities that had inspired her company's mission, Elena had done something that shocked everyone in that room, including herself. She'd stood up, looked each man in the eye and said, "Find different founders." Then she'd walked out, leaving her coat draped over her chair like a discarded symbol of corporate compromise. The February wind had been brutal against her silk blouse, but not nearly as cutting as the realization that success often meant betraying the very values that had driven her to succeed. As she'd wandered the frozen streets, Elena wondered if there was any way to save her company without selling her soul. Any path forward that honored both her investors' demands and her own moral compass. Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her downtown penthouse staring at the ceiling, still wearing Marcus's coat over her silk pajamas. The warmth had long since faded, but she couldn't bring herself to take it off. Something about his quiet generosity haunted her, the way he'd given without expecting anything in return, without even knowing her name. In a world where every interaction felt transactional, his kindness had been shockingly pure. By morning, she'd made a decision that would have surprised the board members who thought they knew her so well. She called her assistant, Maya, with an unusual request. "I need you to help me find someone." A man named Marcus who was at the Ashland bus stop around midnight. "Check the CTA security footage." Maya had worked for Elena long enough to know when not to ask questions. Within 2 days, Maya had tracked down Marcus Rodriguez through a combination of bus records, warehouse employment databases, and old Chicago public schools directories. What Elena discovered made her hands shake as she read through the file. Marcus wasn't just a kind stranger. He was Marcus Rodriguez, the Lincoln High teacher who'd made headlines 5 years earlier for his innovative history program that had helped dozens of at-risk students earn college scholarships. The newspaper clippings painted a picture of an educator who'd revolutionized teaching in underserved communities, who'd created digital learning modules that made complex historical concepts accessible to students who'd been written off by the system. Elena recognized the methodology immediately because she'd spent years trying to replicate similar approaches in her own platform. She'd been searching for someone with exactly his expertise, his passion, his proven track record of transforming educational outcomes for the students who needed it most. The universe, it seemed, had sent him to her disguised as a moment of simple human decency. Marcus was stacking boxes of anatomy textbooks when he saw her walking across the warehouse floor, her heels clicking against the concrete with purposeful determination. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting, Elena Rodriguez looked like she belonged in a different world entirely, her tailored coat a stark contrast to the industrial surroundings. His supervisor, Jerry, hurried over to intercept her, clearly flustered by the unexpected visitor, but she politely dismissed him and headed straight for Marcus. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority he remembered from that snowy night. Marcus set down the box he'd been carrying, suddenly aware of how he must look in his warehouse uniform, safety vest, and work gloves. "About what?" he asked, though something in her expression told him this conversation was going to change everything. Elena pulled out a tablet and showed him the EduTech Solutions logo. "I'm offering you a position as Director of Educational Content. Your job would be designing digital curricula for underserved student populations, incorporating the innovative teaching methodologies you developed at Lincoln High. The salary is $95,000 annually, plus benefits plus equity in the company." Marcus blinked, certain he'd misheard her. The number was nearly triple what he made in a year of warehouse shifts. His first instinct was suspicion. People like Elena didn't offer dream jobs to people like him without ulterior motives. "Why me?" he asked, crossing his arms defensively. "You don't even know me." But Elena was ready for his skepticism. She swiped to a folder on her tablet filled with newspaper clippings, academic articles, and something that made Marcus's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Printed emails from his former students. "Maria Gonzalez is now studying pre-med at Northwestern," Elena said, scrolling through testimonials. "She credits your AP history class with teaching her how to think critically about complex problems. David Chen is pursuing his master's in education because, and I quote, Mr. Rodriguez showed me that teaching could change the world." She paused, meeting his eyes. "These students didn't forget you, Marcus. They're thriving because of the foundation you gave them. I need someone who understands that education isn't just about information transfer, it's about transformation. Your teaching philosophy is exactly what my platform has been missing." 6 months later, Marcus stood in EduTech's sleek conference room, watching a real-time dashboard that tracked student engagement across 12 states. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible during those freezing nights in the warehouse. Over 50,000 students were actively using the learning modules he'd designed, and their test scores were improving at rates that had caught the attention of education researchers nationwide. Elena had given him complete creative freedom to rebuild EduTech's curriculum from the ground up. And Marcus had poured 15 years of classroom wisdom into every interactive lesson, every adaptive assessment, every moment of digital connection between teacher and student. The platform now featured the same storytelling techniques that had once captivated his Lincoln High students. The same scaffolding strategies that had helped kids who'd never seen themselves as learners discover they were capable of brilliance. The transformation hadn't just been professional. Elena and Marcus had developed the kind of partnership that transcended traditional workplace dynamics, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what education could accomplish when it was done right. She'd trusted his vision completely. Even when board members questioned spending development money on features specifically designed for struggling students, their friendship had been forged in late-night strategy sessions and heated debates about pedagogical theory, conversations that reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with teaching in the first place. When the new funding round closed at $12 million, Elena made sure Marcus was the first to know. "We're going national," she told him. grinning like the scrappy coder who'd once built her first prototype in a cramped apartment. Every underserved district in America is going to have access to what you've built. That evening, Marcus received an email that brought tears to his eyes. It was from Maria Gonzalez, his former student, now a junior at Northwestern. She'd heard about EduTech's expansion and wanted him to know that her younger brother would be using his curriculum modules in Detroit next fall, carrying forward the educational legacy that had started in room 247 years earlier.